In 1877, one family controlled more wealth than the United States Treasury itself. Today, you'd struggle to find a single Vanderbilt millionaire. This is the story of America's greatest lost fortune. Built by a Ferry boy, and gone within 3 generations. At its peak, the Vanderbilt fortune was worth more, adjusted for inflation, than most modern tech billionaires combined. And yet by 1973, when 120 family members gathered for a reunion, not a single millionaire could be found in the room. How does that much money simply vanish? The answer says more about human nature than it does about economics. This isn't a story about bad luck. It's a story about what happens when fortune meets no discipline at all. Stick around, because the way this family lost everything is honestly more dramatic than how they built it. It starts on a small ferry boat in New York Harbor, with a 16-year-old boy who had almost nothing. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt, and by the time he died he was the richest man in America. But the fortune he built would barely survive long enough for his great-grandchildren to enjoy it. Here's why. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, the son of a modest farming and boating family. At just 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother to buy his first small ferry boat. He worked relentlessly, undercutting competitors on price, and within a few years, owned a small fleet of his own. Other businessmen began calling him the Commodore, a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. By his 30s, Vanderbilt had expanded from ferries into full steamships, dominating busy shipping routes along the East Coast. He was known for being ruthless in negotiations, often slashing prices until rivals went bankrupt, then buying their routes outright. But Vanderbilt's true fortune wouldn't come from boats at all. It would come from an entirely new industry, railroads. In his 60s, an age when most men were retiring, Vanderbilt pivoted aggressively into the booming railroad business. He consolidated competing rail lines into the New York Central Railroad, creating one of the most powerful transportation networks in America. It was an audacious, late-career bet. Audacious. And it would make him richer than anyone could have imagined. Vanderbilt understood something his competitors didn't. Control the infrastructure, and you control the entire economy built on top of it. He bought rail lines connecting New York to Chicago, creating a direct, efficient route that businesses desperately needed. His railroads carried goods, passengers, and raw materials that fueled America's rapid industrial expansion in the late 1800s. By the 1860s, the New York Central was hauling enormous profits, and Vanderbilt was personally pocketing millions every year. He famously fought off corporate raiders, including a brutal stock battle with rivals trying to seize control of his railroads. In one legendary clash, Vanderbilt cornered the market on a rival company's stock, crushing the men who tried to outmaneuver him. By the time he was finished, Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled a transportation empire stretching across multiple states and industries. He became the single richest man in the United States, with a fortune estimated near $100 million in 1870s money. Adjusted for today's economy, some historians estimate his true fortune may have exceeded $200 billion in relative wealth. It was, by almost any measure, one of the largest personal fortunes the world had ever seen. But it wouldn't last. To understand the scale of this fortune, consider this. At his death in 1877, Vanderbilt was worth more than the U.S. Treasury. His will left the overwhelming majority of his fortune to a single son, William Henry Vanderbilt. Other family members received comparatively modest sums, a decision that created lasting resentment within the extended Vanderbilt family. Cornelius believed concentrating the wealth, rather than dividing it equally, was the only way to preserve the family's power. It was a calculated bet that one disciplined heir could grow the fortune faster than dozens of scattered heirs ever could. And for one generation, that bet actually paid off spectacularly. Spectacularly. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited a fortune of roughly $90 million, and within just 8 years, he had doubled it. By 1885, William was arguably the richest private citizen on the entire planet, worth over $200 million. He once famously declared, regarding public criticism of his wealth, "The public be damned," a phrase that haunted the family's reputation. The Vanderbilt name had become a symbol of both staggering success and growing public resentment toward the ultra-wealthy. William Henry Vanderbilt expanded the family's railroad holdings even further, consolidating more lines and increasing the family's market dominance. But he also began something his father never had time for: spending the fortune on visible, extravagant displays of wealth. He commissioned grand mansions on Fifth Avenue, filled with imported art, marble staircases, and rooms designed purely to impress. His children grew up surrounded by extraordinary luxury, a stark contrast to Cornelius Vanderbilt's famously modest, frugal upbringing. And that contrast mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Wealth without struggle rarely teaches financial discipline. When William Henry died in 1885, his fortune was split among his children, diluting the concentrated wealth strategy his father had insisted on. His sons Cornelius II and William K. Vanderbilt each inherited tens of millions, more money than most countries' entire treasuries. But this generation had grown up with money, never having to build it themselves from nothing. And so their priorities shifted dramatically, away from expanding the empire, and toward something else entirely: spectacle. Welcome to the height of the Gilded Age, where the Vanderbilts didn't just have money, they performed it. The Vanderbilt family began constructing some of the most extravagant private homes ever built in the United States. A 70-room summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, cost roughly $7 million to build in the 1890s. A North Carolina estate sprawled across 175,000 acres, featuring 250 rooms, still the largest privately owned home in America today. These weren't just houses. They were statements, designed specifically to outshine every other wealthy family in the country. The family hosted lavish costume balls, with single parties reportedly costing more than most American families earned in a decade. One infamous 1883 costume ball cost an estimated $250,000, and was specifically designed to secure social status, not just fun. Newspapers covered Vanderbilt parties obsessively, turning the family into America's first true celebrity dynasty, decades before modern fame existed. But every mansion, every ball, every imported tapestry was draining the fortune Cornelius had spent a lifetime building. And unlike railroads, mansions don't generate income. They don't generate income. They simply cost money, year after year, forever. The Vanderbilts were spending like the fortune was infinite. It wasn't. By the time the third generation inherited their share, the family fortune had already been split dozens of different ways. Each subsequent generation inherited a smaller slice, while maintaining, or even increasing, the same extravagant lifestyle expectations. Maintaining a 250-room estate required enormous annual upkeep costs, regardless of how much income the family still generated. Many Vanderbilt heirs had no formal business training, and had never worked a job in their entire lives. They had been raised to spend wealth, not to create it. A skill set that becomes dangerous once the money stops growing. Meanwhile, the railroad industry itself was changing, facing new competition from automobiles, trucking, and eventually commercial aviation. The very industry that built the fortune was slowly becoming less profitable, just as the family's spending habits were increasing. Divorces, lawsuits, and family disputes over inheritances further fragmented what remained of the original concentrated wealth. Some heirs sold off mansions, land, and family heirlooms simply to cover mounting taxes and maintenance costs. Brick by brick, the empire Cornelius Vanderbilt built was being sold off to pay for its own upkeep. By the early 1900s, several Vanderbilt mansions had already been demolished, sold, or donated simply because no one could afford them. The famous Fifth Avenue mansions that once defined New York high society were torn down to make way for commercial buildings. Estate taxes, introduced in the early 20th century, took a significant additional bite out of each generation's remaining inheritance. Unlike Cornelius, who reinvested constantly into new ventures, many later Vanderbilts treated their inheritance as a finish line, not a starting point. Some family members did attempt new business ventures, but few matched the relentless drive of the family's original founder. The family's identity slowly shifted from industrial titans to simply old money, a label that often signals decline, not strength. By the 1940s and 1950s, many Vanderbilt descendants were living comfortably, but were no longer counted among America's wealthiest families. The fortune hadn't disappeared overnight. It had been bled out slowly, generation after generation, decision after decision. And then came the moment that made the family's decline impossible to ignore, captured in a single, now famous gathering. In 1973, descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt organized a massive family reunion at a university bearing the family's name in Tennessee. Roughly 120 Vanderbilt family members attended, gathering to reconnect with relatives many had never even met before. A journalist attending the event reportedly asked the assembled family members a simple, pointed question. "Is anyone here a millionaire?" Not a single person in the room raised their hand. Not one. A fortune that had once rivaled entire national treasuries had, within roughly 100 years, completely evaporated. It remains one of the most cited case studies in financial history about generational wealth, and exactly how fragile it can be. Economists and historians still reference the Vanderbilt story as a cautionary tale taught in business schools around the world. The pattern even has an informal name among wealth researchers: Shirtsleeves to Shirtsleeves in 3 generations. It describes a recurring cycle. One generation builds wealth, the next maintains it, and the third generation loses it entirely. Studies on family wealth suggest the majority of inherited fortunes are significantly diminished or gone by the third generation. The Vanderbilts didn't break that pattern. They didn't break it. If anything, they became its most famous example. So what actually happened? It wasn't one bad decision. It was dozens of small ones, compounding across generations. Wealth was divided among more heirs with each passing generation, while spending habits stayed fixed at the very top. No consistent system was put in place to teach financial discipline, business skills, or investment strategy to the next generation. Mansions and lifestyles were maintained as fixed costs, even as the income generating them slowly declined over decades. And critically, the family stopped reinvesting aggressively the way Cornelius once had, treating wealth as something to preserve, not grow. Today many of the Vanderbilt mansions still stand, but as museums, universities, and historic landmarks, not private family homes. These estates now welcome millions of paying tourists every year, ironically generating more income than they ever did privately. In a strange twist, the buildings outlasted the fortune that built them, becoming the family's most enduring legacy. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe. There are entire dynasties whose rises and falls are even more dramatic than this one. Because the real lesson of the Vanderbilts isn't about how to get rich. It's about how easily fortune can disappear.